Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I would like to discuss the books that I read in the month of August. August was a wonderful and interesting reading month for me. I read a variety of books from classics to historical fiction to a non-fiction self-help type book, which is a genre very much outside my comfort zone. And I finally finished Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. And those of you who have been watching my channel for a long period of time know that I started that last winter and have been ever so slowly making my way through it. And finally, I read something by Geraldine, who is an author that I suspected I would like for the longest time. And I also have some very mixed thoughts on a highly hyped book. So, let's get into the details. The first book I'd like to talk about is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, which I read with Katie from Books and Things. This book was utterly brilliant. Katie had wanted to read it for a while, and I became interested in it after reading Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, and after learning a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston and the original critical reception of Their Eyes Were Watching God. I spoke about it at length before on this channel, but basically Zora Neale Hurston was vastly underappreciated in her time. Anyway, the book is framed as the story of Janie Crawford, a 40-year-old African-American woman recounting her life story to her friend Phoebe. Janie has just returned to the town of Eatonville after running off with a younger man, but her narrative to Phoebe begins at the very beginning. We learn about Janie's family, her mother, her grandmother, her upbringing, and follow along as Janie finds her voice and learns to shape her own destiny despite the expectations thrust upon her. It's a Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story, only Janie's formative years don't seem to end. She's constantly shaping and discovering herself. She's been told who she should be her whole life by her grandmother and by society, but she doesn't envision her life as what her grandmother sets out for her, or what others expect of her. In some ways, the story is this idea of a collective narrative. It's not just the story of Janie, but it's the story of her grandmother, her mother, and in the end, it becomes Phoebe's story to do what she wants with, to tell or not to tell. It's this idea that the African-American female characters are described by Hurston as branches without roots, that their story isn't finished when they are, that Janie in some ways is a branch of her grandmother, and her grandmother lives vicariously through Janie and Janie's story. And so Janie feels this pressure, this burden to continue her grandmother's story and to live in contrast to her mother, rather than to forge ahead with her own dreams and desires. And much like you have the dual narrative of Janie's own desires and her expectations, you have this duality of Janie's internal voice, this gorgeous, poetic prose contrasted with Janie's external voice, a southern dialect with conjunctions and slang and its own rules of syntax and grammar. And the beauty of it is that Janie isn't just one voice or the other. She's this beautiful amalgamation of the two. It's just such a gorgeous book on so many levels. The writing, the way it explores its themes. I was particularly touched by the hurricane scenes towards the end of the book. They're so powerful. If you haven't read this book yet, I can't recommend it enough. I read it as a combination of audiobook and ebook, and I regret not having a physical copy of my own to mark up and annotate. This is definitely one that I'm going to have to buy for myself and reread and mark up to my heart's content. And if the book itself wasn't wonderful enough, the history of its publication and reception adds another layer to its importance. Their Eyes Were Watching God was heavily criticized by prominent black male authors of the Harlem Renaissance, most notably Richard Wright. He wrote this scathing review that I'll link below. You should take a look at it, especially if you've read Their Eyes Were Watching God. But anyway, the book practically disappeared until it was rediscovered about 30 years after its publication date by Alice Walker, and now it's part of the literary canon. It somehow went from a book criticized for its limited portrayal and representation of African American people to being discussed 30 years later as a book concerned with female African American self-discovery and empowerment. Personally, I think the discrepancy in these two perspectives has to do with the intersection of race and gender. While Janie's story is one of self-discovery, it's also a narrative that does not portray the majority of African American male characters in a positive light. There are depictions of violence and abuse towards women, and instances of the men in Janie's life effectively silencing her in her own narrative. The history of Their Eyes Were Watching God is a fascinating look into the legacy of literature and how the reputation of a book is shaped and the role that individuals have in creating the canon. I'm amazed how Zora Neale Hurston resonates with readers from the 1970s and the present day better than in her own time period. Is her genius finally being realized, or has she been completely reinterpreted and reinvented at a later date to cater to modern day mentalities? The history of this book's reception makes me wonder what will endure from our own time, and also how many gems from the past are currently living in obscurity. Are there loads of underappreciated authors whose works have been marginalized and suppressed, just waiting to be reintroduced into the canon? And if so, how can we find them and revitalize them? I also read the much hyped book and tie winner of the Man Booker Prize, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. This book is a series of interconnected short stories featuring 12 women, mothers, daughters, best friends, and colleagues, and it's interesting to, over the course of their chapters, learn how they're all related and to just see the multitudes of experiences and time periods that their stories cover. I found myself questioning the character development in this book, though, and whether the characters were really dynamic, interesting individuals or actually flat and boring stereotypes. And you may ask how it is possible to question such a thing. A character is either well developed or they aren't. But this book does something really interesting. It builds up these stereotypes of women and then breaks them down again so that these characters are all simultaneously a stereotype and their own individual people. They can be interpreted as both, and I think that's the point of the book, that we are asked to question our assumptions and prejudices about people, that we're asked to see each character as both a stereotype, a person belonging to a certain group, and also as an individual. The way this book explores intersectionality is fascinating. But when it comes to the intersectionality of race and gender, I feel like this book had an agenda, or a thesis, namely that feminism and being a woman binds people together more than race, and that gender and womanhood transcends race. I don't know if it was purposeful, but the title seems to support this thesis. Girl, woman, other. First, we're defined as girls, then as women, then as other. That our connections to people, the relationship of family, sometimes biologic, sometimes just our chosen family or support system in general, is what binds us together most of all. And the book had a touching ending that almost made me cry that supports this sentiment as well. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely loved the ending. I thought it was a powerful ending and was beautifully written. But like I said, I don't agree with the sentiment that one category, such as womanhood, takes precedence over any other category, such as race. I think in each situation, a different part of our identity takes precedence. Sometimes it will be race, sometimes womanhood, sometimes motherhood, religion, sexual orientation, occupation, educational status, age, the part of the country you live in. I could go on. There are really endless ways of identifying as a part of something larger than yourself. And maybe what binds us together most of all is this ability we have to slip between these different identities, these different categories, and how this amalgamation of categories shapes us as individuals. Now, this book has no hard stops, no periods to break up sentences. I actually originally picked up this book during lockdown in April, but I only read the first few pages because I had trouble with the lack of punctuation. The next month, though, Jenny from Book Shenanigans left me a message raving about this book and urged me to give it another chance. She was very persuasive, so I obviously did give it another chance, and I listened to it on audiobook instead. I get that not having hard stops was a conscious decision on Evaristo's part. Even though every character can be broken up into chapters and line breaks and categorized in so many different ways, there are no hard stops between them, just as there are no hard stops that separate us as people in life. Ultimately, we are all part of the same book and the same story. And yet, even though I understand and appreciate the rationale behind the decision to omit periods, I still found it pretentious and thought it made the book difficult to read in print. Ultimately, I'm glad I read this book, especially so closely after Their Eyes Were Watching God. It gave me a lot to think about, really. Both books explore the intersections of what it means to be both Black and a woman. And both books, in their own way, deal with the concept of a collective narrative and the idea that we are each an amalgamation of many different identities. Despite the major difference in time period and place, Their Eyes Were Watching God and Girl, Woman, Others speak to each other in really interesting ways. I'm curious if you've read both of them, what you think of them, of course, and also especially how do you think they relate to each other and how are they a part of a larger conversation about gender and race? Sorry, I realize that I have been talking for a long time already and that this is probably going to be a very long video. So I will leave timestamps in the description so you can skip around to where you want to be. In August, I also read People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. The premise of this book was fascinating. It's about an Australian rare book expert and conservationist named Hannah, who goes to Sarajevo to analyze this famous and rare religious Jewish text, a Haggadah that was rescued from the Bosnian War. And as she examines the text, she finds these artifacts within the book. An insect's wing, saltwater stains, wine stains, and a white hair, all of which hold clues to the history of the book and the people that held it throughout the generations. After Hannah begins to explore or research each artifact, a new chapter begins with a concise, short story about the book's past. We go back in time to Sarajevo in 1940, Vienna in 1894, Venice in 1609, Tarragona in 1492, and Seville in 1480. And at each time period, we learn about the people who held the book, who created it and why, how it survived the Spanish Inquisition and World War II. The survival of the book and its history chronicles a clash of cultures, or a melding of cultures, depending on how you look at it, as well as both the best and the worst of history. I enjoyed this book a lot. It was a very ambitious and astounding premise, but I felt like something fell ever so slightly short in its execution. It's not like I found any great fault with the book in any particular respects. There was nothing glaring that I hated. If I'm being extra critical, perhaps the plot was a bit too convenient and tumultuous at times, but it's fiction and it's allowed to take liberties. Even though it is based on a true story, a lot of it was invented by the author, and that's pretty obvious as you're reading. I guess my biggest issue with the book was that it wasn't on the same level for me as Their Eyes Were Watching God. It didn't utterly blow me away. I didn't want to mark up every single page or quote it endlessly. It was a solid 4-star book, and if you think the premise is interesting, you should definitely give it a try. Just maybe don't read it right after an amazing 5-star book. Also following the high of Their Eyes Were Watching God, I read Exactly What to Say, The Magic Words for Influence and Impact by Phil M. Jones. I listened to this one on audiobook on a whim, mainly because it was short and I couldn't decide what to read and nothing seemed like it would be as good as Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I knew that this self-help book sounded like it wouldn't even try to be good literature. Plus, I was frustrated at work. Patient communication is a very important part of my line of work, and it's one of the aspects of my profession that I wasn't actually trained in at all. A big part of the job is helping the patient understand the situation and decide the best option to treat it. Sometimes I get frustrated and think that if I was better at talking to people, I'd be better at my job. You can be the best dentist in the world and do the most intricate and beautiful work, but if you can't convince somebody that they need the treatment, it frankly doesn't matter how good your clinical skills are. It breaks my heart when I have a patient who desperately needs treatment and I can't make them understand that because it doesn't hurt right now, or they have some other barrier against the treatment that I'm just not aware of. So I picked up this book because it's only about an hour or an hour and a half long, and it was more or less a pep talk on interacting with people. It's aimed to make you a better salesperson and communicator in the workplace and your personal life. It gives you a set of words to use more in conversation and explains how to use them and what they accomplish. For example, one of the phrases is, most people. When helping someone make a decision, instead of overtly saying, I think you should do X, it can be helpful to say something more like, most people I've seen in your situation go with X. Evidently, everyone wants to be most people, and if it's the right decision for most people, it makes sense that it's the right decision for them too. There are a little over 20 some odd of these phrases and explanations, and at the end of the audiobook, I felt like many of them were very cheesy and sounded a bit too much like used car salesman tactics. But I also found that I actually already do some of them, just in slightly different ways. It got me thinking about how I interact with people, especially patients at work, and how I can be a more effective dentist without sounding like a used car salesman. So this isn't the type of book that I usually read. It's certainly not great literature, and I don't think that I'll try to read a book like this again for a while at least. But it got me thinking about communication, word choice, and psychology, which is always interesting to me. And last but not least, I actually finished Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens this month. Little Dorrit is about the character of Amy Dorrit, also called Little Dorrit, even though she's an adult. She's 22. I think she's very petite and small and slight, like me, so she's referred to as Little Dorrit. But anyway, Little Dorrit's father is imprisoned in the Marshalsea debtor's prison, and his finances are such a tangled mess that it seems like he'll never be released. Little Dorrit was actually born in the Marshalsea, and though she lives there and takes care of her father, she's free to come and go as she pleases. She's wonderfully self-sufficient, and she has this quiet strength and goodness to her. She has a brother and a sister and an uncle, but it's really Little Dorrit who looks after the whole family, financially and otherwise. She supports them by working as a seamstress for an invalid named Mrs. Clennam. The book actually starts out with the arrival of Mrs. Clennam's son, Arthur Clennam, returning from abroad, and the two main plot threads surround Little Dorrit as she struggles to take care of her family, and Arthur Clennam as he tries to make something of himself back in England. Arthur takes a particular interest in Little Dorrit, and we follow his business endeavors, as well as his attempts to free Little Dorrit's father from debtor's prison. And the whole story just goes on from there. It's Dickens, so naturally there are a ton of other characters and plot threads that I haven't mentioned, and it's fun to see how they all come together in the end. Little Dorrit has such an interesting relationship with her father. Inside the Marshalsea, he is the father of the Marshalsea. Everyone knows him, and he has this position of differential respect. And Little Dorrit is so proud of him, but at the same time, she realizes how little respect his situation commands outside of the prison. I also love Little Dorrit's relationship with Arthur Clennam and their general friendship. Early on, he is rather patronizing towards Amy, and he wants to protect her, but she's clever and self-sufficient and rejects his help. And in the end, it's actually her who saves him, sort of. The book is a beautiful critique of society, of debtors' prisons, of class and bureaucracy. It looks at what it truly means to be a gentleman and to be accepted in society. There are so many wonderful characters. Mr. Myrtle's plotline is fascinating, as are the twists and turns of the plot in general. I love Panks and Daniel Doyce and Affery and so many other minor characters in the cast. So this book was absolutely phenomenal, and if you haven't read Little Dorrit, I highly, highly recommend that you pick it up. For those of you who have been following this channel for a while, you will know that it has been taking a very long time to finish this book, almost a year. I started it in December, I think, and I've been dipping in and out of it ever since. I put it down for months at a time, and I pick it up when I feel like it. And I'm just trying to wrap my head around why it takes me so long to read Dickens. When I read Our Mutual Friend, it took me a long time as well, but I was following along, more or less, with Katie's serialized read-along. This wasn't quite serialized. It's not like I sat down and decided exactly how much of the book I would read at any given time. I think I binge read about half the book in December and January. The sections I read this book in were very erratic and disorganized. I read hundreds of pages at a time and then not pick it up for months. My husband even thought I didn't like the book, which really couldn't be further from the truth. This is the fourth book that I've read by Dickens. I've read Great Expectations, A Christmas Carol, Our Mutual Friend, and now Little Dorrit in that order. And I am falling in love with Dickens as an author. I feel like I still can't say that he's one of my favorite authors until I've read at least half his works, which I'm pretty far away from. But I think what is so daunting to me about his books is how they work on so many levels. They're both enjoyable and entertaining, as well as highly literary and brilliant social critiques of Victorian society. And when I read them for the first time, I want to appreciate them on all of these levels at once, which is virtually impossible. But I try, and the way that I do that is at the pace of a snail, or rather I binge 100 pages or a few hundred pages, and then I spend a few months digesting them. I wish I had read Dickens like I read Jane Austen or Charlotte and Emily Bronte. I read all of those authors in my teens, and so much of their novels went over my head, but I loved them for their plots and their romances, and I just generally enjoyed them without overthinking them. And then I revisited all of them in college and was able to return to them on this analytic and intellectual level and study them deeper. So now when I reread them, I'm able to appreciate so many aspects of their texts at once. But I was first introduced to Dickens in college with Great Expectations, so I never really had the luxury of reading his books like I did when I was a teen. Why am I still holding this? It's really heavy. I'm gonna put it down. Now I find the relationships that I would have shipped as a teenager problematic, and I'm always so busy looking up historical context and underlining quotes that I don't just sit back and enjoy and let the plot unfold on a surface level. I still enjoy the books, but I can't help feeling like I missed out by not reading Dickens earlier. Dickens is just so densely packed with brilliance, and I don't want to miss any of it. And because his books are so long, I don't think I'll be rereading them again for a while. So I feel like I have to read them for the first time with the attention and familiarity that I reread the Brontes or Austen with. Are these concerns relatable to anyone else, or am I just really peculiar? Either way, I would love to read all of Dickens. For those of you who are big fans of Dickens, which of his works would you recommend that I read next? I was thinking maybe Dombey and Son, or The Pickwick Papers, or David Copperfield. Anyway, I'm rambling, and this has already been a very long video, so I'll let you guys go now. Have you read any of these books? If so, I would love to know what you think of them. What have you been reading in the month of August? And as always, I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye!